today.
Hello. Sorry, that was a panic.
No, that's fine. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Siciliano. I'm the MD of Tiger Recruitment. Today is going to be a really interesting session, and we're going to be talking about the future of work. We're going to have an opportunity for everyone to ask questions at the end via sort of the Q&A session on Zoom here. A big thank you to our impressive expert speakers that we've got today as well, who I'm going to start by introducing. We have Bruce Daisley joining us today. Bruce is the former European VP of Twitter. You may have heard of his podcast, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, or his Sunday Times best-selling book, The Joy of Work. We have Dr. Heejung Chung, who is a reader at the University of Kent in Sociology and Social Policy. She is a specialist in workplace flexibility and work-life balance, and she is currently doing really interesting research on this topic in particular. We also have David D'Souza with us today, who is the CIPD's Director of Membership. David has been described by Workplace Insight magazine as one of the UK's most influential HR and workplace commentators. You can hear more about his views on his blog, 101 Half-Connected Things. So today what we're going to be talking about is, I guess, you as our speakers, your predictions on the new normal. We want to share advice with everyone that's tuned in today on how we can prepare for the return to the office and return to work, and also hear a little bit more about our speakers' views on what the future of flexible working is going to look like as well. So let's sort of start off looking at the new normal. David, this is one for you, I guess, and it's sort of just looking at where we are now. Can you give us a bit of an overview of how the HR community have responded in the last 3 months and kind of what things look like at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's never been a more challenging time to work in HR. I think we were in the middle of a global pandemic when, I suppose, layered onto that is you have an increased focus on racism. So you have a group of people, group of professionals attempting to deal with a host of technical and emotional challenges. And then the gears have gone up again. And it's a really interesting time to work in the profession because both of the things that are in those spaces transcend workplaces. So it isn't a new set of laws that have come in that impact HR, isn't another raft of changes in legislation or approach. These are things that kind of strike to the very basis of us being people. So what you've seen is HR teams having to make sense of that and support people through incredibly tough times, whilst also having those challenges to face themselves. And I think we've seen some examples of poor practice, which inevitably get highlighted by the media. But I also know that there are HR teams that have done incredible work at the moment, supporting people in what can be really isolated roles. So it's been tough, but actually we're starting to deal with some really fundamental challenges in the workplace. And to set out, I suppose, first of all, I'd say this is the new abnormal at the moment. This isn't the new normal. I don't think it's going to stay like this, and this is a phase. And what we shouldn't do is probably hyperextend from where we are as to how things may look in the future. But what we do need to do is look at the amount of things that are potentially shifting or in motion and start thinking about some of those that we might want to anchor on because they're positive change.
Yeah. What are some of the areas that you would highlight as, I guess, the positive changes that you've seen and can take out of this as well?
So I think we've seen, not just in the HR profession, but actually, across the piece, more understanding of wellbeing, both emotional and physical. So that's shot up the agenda from kind of a nice to have or an area people were looking at in that way.
Yeah.
I think it's important, not just use the HR terminology of diversity and inclusion, but actually you're seeing human rights and equality coming to the fore in the workplace discussion as well. So that's a really positive thing. And obviously we've seen this massive shift in terms of, I suppose, flexible working, remote working, however you'd like to describe it, but it's not wholly flexible. And that's a really important point to make as well. If you are enforced to work from a location, it is by default not flexible. So what we've seen, I think, is an investment in technologies to enable people to work remotely and an expectation and adjustment, potentially short term to that. But there's a bigger prize at stake there, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Heejung, I know that you've been running a study on working from home and the impact on workers' individual sort of work-life balance. What are some of the findings that you've seen to date on that?
Just to start off, so on the basis of that first, is like you have to understand the UK, like the right to flexible working has been introduced 17 years ago, and there has been an expansion, but there hasn't been really like an enormous expansion of flexible working despite the legal changes. So we were, just before the COVID virus lockdowns, we're looking at something around 15% of the working population being able to work from home, and about like a quarter to a third of workers having some sort of flexi time. So that's controlling their starting and ending times of work. Now, as you know, like that has just exploded in terms of the amount of people who are working flexibly. And as David said, sometimes not necessarily because they want to, because there is no other way to work other than to work from home because of the lockdowns due to COVID. And so we are saying approximately, I think like approximately, and it depends on the data you see, at least in the UK, approximately like half of the working population is working from home to a certain extent. And also something that we don't really talk about is that a lot of people who are actually going into work are using flexi time much more, because as we've seen, especially in the London tubes, etc., having staggered starting and ending times is so much safer for workers and making sure that they're protected against the virus. And well, I kind of say that, I mean, what is this normal? First, there is actually quite a bit of a positive kind of, the people are very positive about the experiences. Now, I'm not saying everyone. And in a way, I kind of like to say almost like the genie is out of the bottle, like you can't put that back in anymore, because previous to the COVID lockdown, a lot of managers have said that a lot of the work that was done, even in the offices, could not be done at home. And one of the biggest hesitations from the managers is, on one hand, the capacity for workers to work from home effectively at home, with the same kind of effectiveness or productivity that they would show in the office, but also in a way, like possibly a kind of a lack of trust that the workers will do their jobs. Now, obviously, a lot of managers did not have any choices, or companies did not have any choices, but to let workers work from home, because the other option would be either put them in a very, very insecure in terms of health and safety issues, positions, or do no work at all. And what we've seen is that a lot of the work that many people did not think was possible to be done at home is possible, but also despite the extraordinary circumstances that we're under in terms of school lockdowns, as well as in terms of, not being able to access a lot of the kind of infrastructure that we were relying on, people are working very, very effectively. And one of the things we can say is that I think this has really has probably provided a turning point for workers and managers to see how much flexible working can actually work. And again, this is without having any preparation or any infrastructures that were put in place, because this lockdown kind of happened quite quickly for most. So we didn't actually have the time to prepare. And despite everything, people are doing so well. And especially, I think one of the things we see is that people, this is a study from the US, for example, 98% of the people who were surveyed said that they want to work flexibly in the future. A lot of the data that we're seeing now, we're still gathering, and everybody who is watching this webinar, if you can fill it out, that would be fantastic. One of the things that we do see is that the demand for working flexibly has expanded enormously. So this is not just working from home, but also flexi time. And again, because of some of the issues around health and safety issues around COVID, we might but see that kind of pattern. And one other thing to note is that, this whole working from home, especially, people don't want just themselves to work from home, but they want their partners to work from home. Because especially during the school lockdowns or school closures and nursery closures, a lot of parents could only really were able to work when both parents were at home. Because if you couldn't really work if you have especially 2 or more children, and you're the only person working from home, that just leaves you kind of pick up between, once your spouse is at home till like 1, 2 a.m., which we have seen for some couples where one person is a key worker, or, goes into work and the other works from home. So again, this has really shifted the demand, but also possibly the imagination or what people believe as the capacity to work from home in the future. So I do see a trend that will be quite changing rapidly. But having said that, just one more thing to add is we're not saying that everybody's going to be working from home 5 days a week, every week.
Yeah.
That is not what people want, because we do see, as David mentioned, a lot of people suffering from isolation and not being able to kind of communicate well with colleagues and managers. And this is something that, you know, people want flexibility, but not in that enforced way, but also not in this incredibly total flexibility where offices are disappear altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've done our own candidate research, and I think our research showed there were 87% of respondents that came back and said, actually, this working remotely has had a positive impact on my lifestyle. So I think it is something that we can all see now. We do want to embrace it and move forward with it. David and Bruce, is there anything that you sort of think of Heejung's findings that perhaps struck a chord with you as well?
I mean, look, you know, I don't know the findings precisely. The thing that I think that's of interest to me is that how we've gone through some different stages of this. So, the first year of lockdown, I think all of us were sort of feeling like we were just trying to cope. Few stress streams going on, trying to sort of deal with the chaos of getting connected and sort of avoiding distractions in the house. The second year of lockdown, probably we sort of found ourselves finding that there were norms that we were sinking into. And I think in this third year of lockdown, we're starting to recognise that actually some things that we thought were temporary are actually long term. For me, I ask you to spare a thought for all those desk plants that people left abandoned on their desk, that probably they felt, listen, I'm just going to be back in a few weeks. And yet now these across the offices of the United Kingdom, these little scorched, atrophied plants that unfortunately haven't made it through. And I think that's an illustration that we saw this as quite a short-term thing. Yeah. It's just interesting that a lot of firms in the interim, I mean, you mentioned the 87% there, but a lot of firms have done a similar thing. I chatted to someone who is one of the senior people at a very, very major British media brand, and he said to me, we have 1,400 people coming into this building every day in a normal day, and in the last 8 weeks or 12 weeks, we've had 30 people, and the product hasn't changed. And I tried to estimate without his support that their annual rent bill will be something in the region of £7.5 to £8 million a year. You can imagine if you could move to something that looks like the best of both worlds, some wonderful co-working style spaces, wonderfully upgraded meeting spaces, you can imagine they could reduce their footprint by 3/4. And we're seeing a lot of firms do that. In the US, there's an insurer called Nationwide. They've said they're going to close 16 of their 20 offices. In the UK, Barclays have said maybe the idea of bringing people into 7,000 people into one building every day is a thing of the past. And I think we're right in that zone. The really interesting thing is that I don't think we've actually hit the moment where there's been a full recognition that what we've done is permanent. You know, the stock prices for commercial property businesses they've dropped by about 40%. They haven't dropped anywhere close to probably what the real Armageddon that we're looking at. So I think we're in this zone where it's only dawning on us gradually that some of these things that we've been temporarily adapting to, we're like kids who've been moved during the middle of the Blitz. We've been moved down to our escapes out in the countryside. We haven't yet realized that this is the new reality. And I think it's going to be dawning on businesses in various stages over the next few months.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite interesting as well. We're hearing about a lot of companies that are now using this opportunity where people aren't in the office to perhaps revamp some of their office space and, you know, reduce the number of people on each floor, but create those more collaborative workspaces, taking into account they're not going to have people in the offices regularly. If we are looking at that, you know, return to the office, Bruce, can you give us a bit of an overview on the research that you've seen and the conversations you've had with some business leaders around returning to the office?
Yeah, well, if you look into the realities of this, most commercial landlords recognise that the most occupancy that they can have, depending on how densely your desk density was before, it can be 30 to 50% of what you previously had. So I chatted to the commercial director of one business. He said to me, we've created the blue team and the red team. Blue team come in Monday, Wednesday, alternative Fridays, and the red team come in Tuesday, Thursday, and alternate Fridays, starting in probably September. And so, you know, a lot of us are working out that maybe that thing that we've become nostalgic for, that sort of the desk chatter, the office banter, the sort of the spontaneous suggestion to adjourn to the pub on Friday afternoon, all of those things to a large extent are not going to be even possible for probably the next 12 months, you would guess. It doesn't look like a vaccine's on the immediate horizon. So obviously, when you're in that situation, you then have to say, okay, if we're genuinely making plans now that probably take us to September 2021, the question has to be, do we keep these sort of offices looking like they are? Or do we, to your point, you know, if 7 out of 8 workers are saying, I kind of prefer this new balance I've got, do we transition something? And for me, that's been a really fascinating opportunity to go and look at companies that have been doing this since day one. So there's a lot of tech firms that often more by accident than design have found themselves with no offices. One of the ones that I find most intriguing to look at is the company that makes WordPress. They're called Automatic. But there's other companies, if you are sort of keen to benchmark these, there's a company called Basecamp. There's a company called Buffer. There's a lot of companies that have no offices. But what you discover about these remote-only organizations, the guy, Matt Mullenweg, the guy who runs Automatic, the WordPress people, he says there's almost 5 stages of remote work. First stage of remote work is what we used to do, that moment when you've got the plumber coming round, you'd take a couple of phone calls from home. Second stage of remote is where you transfer everything you were doing at the office and you do it remotely. Sounds familiar. You know, it's not uncommon for me in conversations to hear people. I chatted to someone just before this who said, I had 35 meetings last week. So it's not uncommon for us to just transfer. The really interesting thing is looking at these companies that have been remote and baked it into their DNA. And the one thing that Automatic talk about, they say, if the old model of work was that we spend 11 months in the office and 1 month a year out of the office, sort of on holiday, our model is you spend 11 months of the year out of the office, but 1 month a year together with your colleagues, you know, either in a location together. Really interesting, sort of complete inversion. But what they set about doing is they say, okay, we're not going to have people whose experience of work is being on continuous Zoom calls. You know, if my mum knew how much of my time I would be spending glued to a screen, she'd have given me different advice when I was a 7-year-old, when I was told to get away from the TV set. And so, you know, they're not trying to create that version of work. They're trying to create something that is often using the power of asynchrony. So where effectively people put comments into a document to collectively over the course of 48 hours rather than sitting in a meeting together. And it's really interesting to see these companies. I've been so enchanted with it. I've created a newsletter that I've been trying to document these things, because I think to some extent we're making the rules as we go along, and it's just interesting to learn from these experts.
Yeah. I feel like it's something that we see a lot more from those tech companies and the more creative clients, but a lot of our professional services clients are the ones that I think are finding it a little bit more difficult to embrace flexible working, remote working. And one of the big things is around sort of what it means for their culture. David, I don't know if that's something that you've seen, but what if we are looking at this as the new workplace is this element of flexible working and working from home? What does that mean for culture within companies? Oh, David, can you hear?
Culture is always a really interesting thing to talk about, because people define it in different ways. Or people say it can't be defined, and it can, and there are some pretty good definitions out there. But Edgar Schein probably gives one of the best ones, which is it's something that's been sufficiently successful to be taught and appreciated by the organisation, so it'll be repeated. And I think what is interesting is that lots of the organisations that you'd cite in this space is doing it well in terms of remote working. Particularly some of the tech organisations, there'd be other cultural challenges that they need to face into. Diversity and inclusion being a key one, strength of voice within those organisations also being a key one. So I think Bruce is absolutely right that actually, getting used to different ways of working, including asynchronous working, really important. And Basecamp have written some really good open source guides in this space as well. So I'm actually a big fan, but I think we need to be really conscious of the cultures that we're creating and the side effects of some of the working styles, because some of them will work for some people, some of them will definitely not work for others. So if we're talking about flexible working, it needs to be flexible working. That is an incredible opportunity actually to broaden out talent pools, to bring people in a more inclusive way and to work in a fundamentally different way. What you don't want to necessarily do is just look to some of the organizations and say, well, because you've been doing it for a long time, it must work for every aspect of your culture. So I think it's examples of it working, examples of it failing. It's really important for every organization, not just to lionize some of the organizations that have been doing this for a long time, but to think really consciously about how do we want to be, how do we want to treat our people, how do we want to work with our customers, and what are the implications for the working patterns and the things we'll adopt, and do that in a really rounded way. Because otherwise you'll see what I think a lot of organizations, more traditional ones, have done. They've taken their prior working practices and they're just doing them virtually. And we've heard a lot about Zoom fatigue, and Bruce kind of talked about it. You know, you can't work that way in a sustained fashion. But actually, there are probably things around the way they work and the type of work they do that need to be accommodated, and they need to find different things. So part of it's reflecting internally on what you need and designing effectively around that whilst learning from the outside. It can't just be a lift and drop of a tech company's ways of working, because that probably won't work for a traditional professional service.
So do you think it's then important for companies to really look at that culture and what they're trying to create, what they want to keep a hold of, and just apply their flexible working practices to that? Like, I think that can be a really sort of big area for companies to start with. So what are some of the smaller steps they can take?
Well, I think Heejung touched upon the area of trust, and that is the core for a lot of this work. So yeah. My favorite story was probably from about 5 years ago. Was an organization that moved to remote working, but the primary driver was cost saving. And that's understandable for some organizations, but they had a no emptying the dishwasher policy. So their level of focus on people and their lack of understanding of, I guess, how life and work have to wrap around if you're not in the office, were really naive. So the prime thing organizations need to do is listen. So more so than at any other time, this isn't about having an annual survey. This is about actually having active, open channels with people to ask how they are, think about their well-being. Genuinely, there are some areas of an organization it's quite easy to judge productivity. There are some areas it's really hard. So think about what you're trying to achieve in those spaces. So there's never been a better time for quality interactions and trust. There's never been a more legitimate time in most of our lifespans to ask people, how are you doing, and genuinely mean it, and not feel an intrusive question. So we have the legitimacy to step into a space and investigate what works for people. But at the core of flexible working, or a flexible working culture, is people having access to different styles of working that will help them add time to their preference. And we need to make sure it's that, not just lifting and dropping the old culture and sticking it in a virtual environment, because that's not going to work for anyone long term.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is really the key to it. It is about flexibility. So people don't really want this to be prescripted and told, like, you know, there are certain days we want you to be in or we don't want you to be in. So different things are going to work for different people as well. Heejung, another interesting point, you know, that's been raised to us as well. Like, I know your work is looking at the disparity between male and female employees when it comes to flexible working options. Some of that can come into play, you know, when you are looking at women who are, you know, having a career break to have children and things like that. What do you think needs to happen to level the playing field?
I just kind of also, like related to that, and also kind of what David just said about culture change. Someone was saying in another webinar I took part in that everybody is we are all BBC dads now. I don't know if you guys remember this. A few years ago, there was a professor in Korea where he was doing an interview with BBC, BBC News and World News, and like his daughter kind of walks in as well, like a little baby, and then he had to like push them out of the scene because it was a live TV interview. And I think that's kind of where we are. It's like before we were in this work culture where you're seen as workers, and especially women wanted to make sure that you're seen as just a worker, because there's been so much stigma against mothers' productivity, women's productivity when they have children. So you're just kind of being shown as, I am a worker without any other responsibilities outside work. I don't have anything else. I only privilege work. And that was in many ways considered what we consider the ideal worker. Now, that has changed because everything is blurred, right? We're working and living in the same space. And and for many people, especially those working from home, there's no real clear demarcation of the physical boundaries as well as the temporal boundaries of work and family life. But also, this is such a crucial time for managers to understand the kind of work and family demands that workers are faced, because without it, it's impossible for people to be able to really meaningfully work and be productive. And as David said, well, the key things that we need to do now is to have that conversation about, hey, what are some of the kind of limitations, some of the demands that we don't talk about within the workplace, but it's outside your work. So kind of have that kind of conversation about not just family. Now, we're not even talking just about parents with young children. It could be you have elderly parents you need to take care of. It might be that you have some sort of illnesses or some sort of vulnerabilities of yourself. It could be physical or mental health illnesses, or it could be anything else. It could be also about a meaningful community, volunteering, etc. But have that conversation where bringing that kind of discussions in is going to actually make the workplaces better, because once people are able to balance those things together, are they going to be actually better workers? Now, about the gender point, it's this really crucial point in terms of equality, because as many analyses have shown that the COVID virus and the lockdown is disproportionately affecting women. Also, BAMEs, like Black and Asian ethnic minority ethnic groups as well. But putting that aside for just a second, like it's women because of the carriages and the school closures, et cetera, and in a way, especially women have to have that conversation because they have no other means to. Because if you need to go into work and your child is still at, the schools are still closed, there's no chance that you're going to be able to make it. But more importantly, possibly, and this is something I'm trying to push, is that we need to get men to talk about their personal needs, right? Because for a very long time, men were seen as the breadwinners. So even if you have a family, even if you have other responsibilities outside of work, you kept a secret because your main role is the breadwinner. That's what defined you. But that is really harmful for equality, because that prevents men from taking part in other types of family responsibilities, but also that pushes women to take on the bigger burden. Now, we can't have that continue, because we will then lose so many of the precious human resources that women can bring into companies. And a lot of companies rely on women and their skill sets to survive. And of course, that will be so in the future. To be able to do that, we need to ensure that men have that conversation about what it means for them to work flexibly and what they need to ensure that not only that they have a work-life balance, but they could support their partners. I know this is very heteronormative, and I do apologize. But, again, even with homosexual men, have this conversation about, the demands that you have, not just for yourself, but your partner and the whole family. One thing that I also want to talk about was about, and maybe this will come up, but I think it was Bruce or David, like something about this flexibility is not always like perfect, everything is fine. If we don't have any conversations about what it means to be productive, what it means to be effective, if you just put the old work culture and the format and the way we think about productivity into remote working or virtual offices, you're going to have the same problems with presenteeism, same problems with ineffective work. And in a way, we need to ensure that managers are prepared to actually be able to really protect and manage workers in that virtual setting, which includes ensuring that the blurring of boundaries between work and family life could be good because you could balance it, but also ensure that it doesn't go and encroach family life. One of the patterns we see both in the US and the UK a lot is that, and this is a study based on my own studies, that when you have that flexible boundaries, sometimes it goes so that work kind of encroaches over family life. So flexible workers tend to work longer. People who work from home tend to work longer. And that means that we need to actually find some meaningful ways in which we could actually better protect workers, even when they're not in the offices. And one of the best ways of doing that is to completely, really have a question about what do we mean by productivity? What do you mean by effectiveness? And really have that conversation about how do we change the work culture so that we actually have good, indicators of success.
Definitely. And I think as well, again, that's where that side of flexibility is one, it's going to look very different for one family as it could for another family. All those things come into play. But then again, we're seeing where, you've got the younger generation that are coming through the workforce, and they've got totally different ideals and notions on what flexibility is compared to, a parent or someone who's got the demands of that family as well. Bruce, is there anything that you would say just around sort of how we look at, that embracing flexibility in the workforce for people that have got differing requirements and differing lifestyles?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a significant gap. What I chatted to one worker at telecommunications work, and he said, look, in our work broadly, you can separate those who empathise with the situation of having care responsibility, whether it's children or parents that they're dealing with, and those who don't have that, because I'm expected to be on a lot of calls when it's simply not possible for me to balance it. So I think these definitely, even in progressive and open-minded organizations, I think there's a very differentiated level of experience, and I suspect that's going to continue. The one thing that is likely to catch up with firms eventually is that more than ever before, I suspect, we talked a little bit about workplace culture, but more than ever before, as people are going into 2021, 2022, people are going to be thinking, if I change jobs, and I know that's something that we haven't given a lot of consideration to. A lot of us struggle with the idea that how would you start with a new company right now, or how would you choose to leave a company? But a lot of people are going to be looking to try and assess what the worked experience is like. So sites like Glassdoor, I suspect, are going to really come into their own. If you look at Glassdoor now, the number one thing that people rate as the most important thing that determines their fondness of a company, or how they will choose a company, the number one thing right now is workplace culture. And I suspect, even though we might not have a workplace to any sort of meaningful extent for the next few months, thinking about your experience of work is going to be really critical. So I'd expect, if people are starting to think about maybe next year or the year after changing jobs, they're going to be thinking, okay, genuinely, what is the proven experience of people being able to work flexibly, being able to adapt to their own personal needs. And more than ever before, I think those sites will come into their own.
Yeah, definitely. So again, we've talked about there is this huge reliance on these Zoom calls, which are all sort of attached to throughout the day at various times. Another big thing has been around technology and businesses needing to adapt technology processes very quickly. I don't think as many businesses considered the limitations technology would have on a remote workforce. David, I think you've sort of looked at this area a little bit more as well. Like, what are some of the challenges that you've seen businesses have faced around technology, and how they need to improve that for remote working?
First of all, I'll flip back to my kitchen, which is where I actually was, just simply with Heejung, which is a really good point, actually. That for years we've talked about, bringing your whole self to work. Now work has come to lots of people, pretty definitely. I think in terms of what we've seen organisations seeing, it's been really interesting to see the different parts of the process change. So Bruce mentioned induction or onboarding, or any other kind of way that organisations describe people starting with them. And that has been, there are some flows in there around proof of identity and things like that, which have been really interesting to see change. But how do you make someone feel genuinely welcome and help them understand the culture when you're not there? And actually, you asked earlier some kind of practical steps. Basecamp have actually open sourced almost all of their kind of guides, and if you just look at their handbook, it's a wonderful articulation of the company culture, because it's about 10 pages long, and by the end of it, you pretty much know what it is to work there and how they go about their rapid IT deployment. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're back.
Really rapid IT deployment, and lots of organizations where it was impossible to get anything done rapidly suddenly had to roll out Teams or and everyone had to get used to Zoom calls. I've had tech day, I think, so one of the things that's happy teams, I think, need a lot of credit for the speed that they've rolled out hardware to people and the speed in which they've managed to switch on systems they didn't think were possible. The challenges that then come within that are some of the ones that Bruce talked about, which is if an organization started in this space, they are used to the workflows, they're used to different channels, they're used to using different tools. If you just transported that from the workplace, it's almost impossible to get that workflow up. And that can be really overwhelming. That can be really stressful for people. And to Heejung's point, it can also create an incredible sense of isolation, because the way that we used to check in with colleagues, or the accidental or serendipitous connections that we used to have disappeared. So by and large, organizations have managed to do about 2 years worth of change management in a really short period. The challenge is actually how you then, the impact of that technology and the way you use it isn't necessarily natural for a whole host of people for different reasons.
Yeah, excellent. So finally, I'd just like to hear a little bit more on your thoughts around leading the way forward for change, and how we can take the lessons that we've learnt over the last 3 months and continue to move forward in a positive way with flexible working. Bruce, what qualities do you think employees will need to have in order to successfully adapt to the new workplace?
Well, I think David mentioned, you know, the well-being and the importance of sort of staying on an even footing for mental health point of view, I think has been one of the most important things. One of the things we were probably familiar with before, there was some research from last year saying that 42% of British people don't have a single friend at work. And I suspect that will become even more stark. You know, the fact that people don't feel connected. There's definitely going to be good organizations and bad organizations. Someone contacted me via my podcast yesterday. They contacted me saying that they're a call center worker. Really interesting to imagine this. They're a call center worker and they've been taking their calls at home. So probably a lot of us don't realize that, you know, when we're phoning our bank or our provider right now, we are still connecting to someone who is working from home. But they were really struck. They said to me that the average experience of a call center worker is that you spend a lot of day on the phone with really angry people. And they said it was starting to affect their own perception that they used to have a safe space, that you used to come home, you know, you'd pour yourself a glass of wine or a cup of tea and you could sort of switch off from work. But, you know, they were now right in the place that they were experiencing these sort of battle zone encounters all day. It was hard for them to switch off. Just an interesting reminder that, you know, the experience of this is very different across the different sectors of work. I think from my point of view, I recognise David's pushback of saying that we should be cautious of looking expressly at firms that are in a engineering environment that can do things in a certain way. I do think that adaptability, though, that willingness to maybe learn from other sectors is probably going to be one of the most important things. For line managers, if a line manager's sitting there and the burden of meetings for their team is getting into double digits of hours every week, then I think looking to other firms in other sectors, albeit that we might consider them not necessarily to be directly applicable, I think it can be helpful. So I would say a degree of resourcefulness is going to be really important. We're all going to require a lot of mental resilience, but almost certainly by the end of next year, there will be a big differentiation. It's almost like we're all racing cars or racing horses on the line. And the ability for us to try things, adapt and throw away the things that don't work will probably will help determine who gets to the line at the end of 2021 in a earlier and in a better place, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, again, if you're looking at that for the individual employee, like job satisfaction, professional goals, work-life balance, like what are some of the things that mean, like what do we need to do as businesses to kind of change what we're offering to our employees?
I think for a large amount of time right now, you know, one of the things I remember working at a very big tech firm when the chief exec changed, and the first thing that anyone does in a position of power when uncertainty happens is we often try and exert control. And the chief exec sent around an email saying that from now on, 30-minute meetings will be 25-minute meetings, and I'm changing this in your calendar. Control. We all reach for control. You can still see that feature in Google Calendars today, but we all reach for control when we're in a position that we feel out of control. And what a lot of bosses have done in this situation when they feel out of control is they've summoned everyone to these relentless video calls, because, you know, if they can see everyone's clean faces presented in front of them, then they can tell themselves that work is being done. And of course, it's completely false. You know, if people are sitting there feigning interest, staring into their camera, that doesn't mean that necessarily they're working, but rather than they're sort of falling into a hole of presenteeism. And I think that's the interesting thing, that, you know, actually what the opportunity here for all of us is that for the first time in a long time, we're being asked to consider what our job actually is. So often our email is sort of landing the plane of dealing with our inbox, sort of navigating the coming and the going of emails and turning up for meetings. So much of that is our job that we actually don't even ask the question, am I doing something productive? And the opportunity presented by this disruption is that a lot of us can sit there going, okay, what is my job? And what 4 actions can I make every day to do my job better, rather than just meetings and emails? So there's a big opportunity presented by this. And I think the more that we unpick what we're currently doing, the more we can get to that solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just jump on that just for a second? One of the things that we see also, not just from my own survey, but other surveys, is that because people are completely time deprived at the moment. I mean, not everybody, but many of us are, especially parents, but also because, you know, like everything is a bit more difficult, isn't it? Because we're unable to, like, even go shopping as a military exercise. And I think this is a really interesting point for many of us who actually had to go through the process of before, like, this is kind of a Dadaism in terms of art culture. It's like, what is work used to be defined as, if you have your bum in your office seat for how many hours, that is considered work, regardless of what you actually carried out during those times. I'm not saying, like, you know, everything was meaningless, but that was kind of how we defined work. And then the way how managers defined work, and like, oh, so-and-so is in the office 11 hours a day, he must be doing a lot of work, right? Whereas now we're time deprived, but also like that boundaries are like, so you actually can see how how that amount of time that you are spending on work is depriving you of doing other things. And really workers are getting focused in terms of what needs to be done, prioritizing work, but also making sure, like, to have that question, possibly had a really good push in terms of what is meaningful work? Like, what is it of my work that is really meaningful, and what is it that isn't actually producing much for myself or the company? But I think for some managers, they're still stuck on, as Bruce says, that control. And I actually have a really good example where the manager is he was not allowing anyone to work from home before. And so he still has that 9 o'clock meeting where everybody has to be there and have to tell what they've been doing, and even have another afternoon meeting so that he could kind of have some sort of a micro control everybody, but without even thinking about how that actually is preventing his workers from actually doing work, because he's like pushing people to kind of follow his schedule of what he thinks is kind of productivity.
Yeah, definitely. And it's almost like, you know, working from home means everything's sort of stripped back to bare bones, where you're just looking at what have you got to do every day, what is taking up your time that perhaps shouldn't be taking up your time, and is preventing you from producing results as well. So yeah, I think they're all interesting things to look at. Where we do have, you know, managers that are struggling with this, not wanting to let go of having the 9 o'clock meeting to say, yes, you know, everyone is here, we're online, those sorts of things. And then you've got the pushback from employees who are saying, well, I can do my job and I don't need to be micromanaged and overlooked. Like, Heejung, like, what do you think is the best way that leaders can manage that resistance from their workers on, you know, there's that give and take at the moment between, you know, companies that are trying to keep some of the control and employees that are trying to, you know, change things and, you know, want to see things sort of move forward in this more flexible working way as well?
Well, there's 2 things. One is, I think David or Bruce or both of you have mentioned, is that this is a really good time to get workers involved in terms of as a group, and it could be in the small unit or it could be the overall company, is like, what is meaningful work? What do we want as a success point in terms of what do you want to achieve as a group or a company? And what is the best way of achieving that? And, you know, again, you know, if for those of you who had the kind of like business management studies, like, you know, high performance strategy where worker involvement is key in trying to design a successful story of what is meaningful, what is productivity effectiveness. And use this opportunity possibly to have workers really, because a lot of us have been doing that reflection of what my job really needs, like what of my job really needs to stay, what can go, and be much more open about it. Now, there is a limitation to that, is because, again, we're still kind of working under the culture of these very kind of long, traditional, you know, probably dating back from the 1950s, where most of our work culture really was based on the industrialized kind of manufacturing, you know, like 9-to-5 styles. And people are still slightly afraid of being able to voice their concerns or, you know, their kind of family demands, because they're afraid of kind of deviating away from, as I mentioned before, the ideal worker image. Just on flexible working alone, I mean, this is changing, but before the COVID virus, like a third of workers still felt like flexible working makes more work for others, they are less productive or committed, and you know, it results in negative career chances. So in a way, without actually having a real, you know, like, I'm not saying tear everything apart, but like to have that conversation and try to really tackle some of these key, very embedded belief systems of what needs to be done to be a good worker or a good company. Yeah. Again, not just by the manager, but as a team, as a whole, it needs to be done. Otherwise, you know, you're going to still fall under these ideas of presenteeism. Like one last thing, I was like, you know, again, I think Bruce, I think mentioned, like this isolation. There are issues around social isolation, and I think one of the reasons why people didn't work from home or didn't work flexibly in previous times was because they missed the interaction. To make sure that workers don't resist, let's say, possible move into further kind of remote working, is that some of these things that we had in the office kind of work culture, which wasn't necessarily planned, but took place, which is really important for the work culture, such as the informal interactions with colleagues and the community kind of feeling within the culture. In a way, managers need to now deal with this as a, like, really intentionally try to see how to enable that, rather than just relying on, oh, it will just happen, to really make sure these are understanding that some of those interactions that happened in the office were really meaningful and effective and important. Then address it, then say, okay, we need to ensure, how do we then bring that forward? And I think Bruce was saying, in certain companies who everybody is remote working, they do that really intentionally, have people come together solely for that group community feeling development, right? So that is like their whole purpose, because those CEOs or managers understand that that is such a crucial element in working as a team.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess finally, just looking at our last question, it's the year 2025. Can you each give us your key predictions on how we'll all be working differently? David, we'll start with you.
So first of all, hopefully I'm a bit clearer now. My laptop had unilaterally decided to connect to my mobile phone instead of the Wi-Fi. So apologies for any glitches that have been caught. I think now is a really bad time for predictions, even though you've kind of asked. I think I have some hopes and fears, and they're possibly as important as predictions, because the world isn't short of predictions at the moment. And my hope is that we genuinely take a period of turmoil and discomfort and pain and create something far more positive out of it. Heejung kind of talked about, you know, good work, quality of work. And if I'm allowed to swear in my brief time that's connected well, David Graeber wrote a brilliant essay on bullshit jobs a few years back, which are the jobs where people just suspect that actually there's not really any value to it, but they're getting paid for it, so they keep going. If we can move to a place where actually genuinely we're delivering value and we're making a difference, that would be really healthy. And my fear is that either we make enforced changes that enforced changes driven by profit that reduce the quality over the next few years, or that we gradually go back to the old ways of working, but just different methodologies for them. And I think that has to be the biggest challenge. And the other one is that we genuinely have inclusive workplaces. And by that, I mean, for every survey that says 80% of people are coping well, we need to recognise 20% aren't. And I think it's really easy to focus on some of the headlines, but we need to look at both sides of the equation every single time. So I am genuinely hopeful, because for years we've been talking about disruption in business and not much has changed particularly quickly. Now we have the opportunity where everything's been thrown up in the air for the most tragic circumstances. We can start deciding where we want to come down. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also fearful.
Yeah, excellent. And Bruce?
I think a lot of us have talked about the importance of workplace culture, and it's often felt like this sort of visceral, intangible thing. But I think more than ever before, we're going to move to a situation where in 5 years' time, there is going to be a strongly differentiated series of workplace cultures. It's almost, you know, when we've invited firms to write their values on the wall and describe their sort of experience of the job, very often the results that you get back when you survey people are broadly the same, you know, and more than anything, the determinant of what workplace culture is like, as much as some Silicon Valley firms might try to pretend to us that their culture is better, broadly our experience of our job is largely determined by our line manager. That's going to change. There's going to be a very strongly different experience of workplace cultures, and people are going to have to try and work that out. I think firms will try and project it from the outside. I think we're going to reach something different. You know, a lot of us, I think, when we were making the journey from school into university, if we were told that the university didn't have the ability for us to do our job with any degree of autonomy, go to the library when we wanted, to do our study in the way we wanted, we would have considered it restrictive. And I suspect there'll be the same fragmentation, that some firms will feel that they focus on what your output is, that they allow you to work in a very liberated way. You feel part of something. You can go in, a bit like meetup culture for the internet. You know, you can go in and you can have physical meetings at times, or you can get together for big gatherings. I suspect we're going to see something close to that. The unfortunate thing is that it will be polarized. So in as much as, you know, we might talk about glorious workplaces right now, there's plenty of people working in pretty wretched conditions in big retail firms or in Amazon warehouses. So there's definitely a stratification right now of work experience, and that's only going to continue. So my feeling is probably more than ever before, a differentiated work culture and a realistic one will be something that strongly separates the good firms from the bad firms. And it's all about how organizations are thinking about that and trying to evolve towards it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Heejung?
I don't think I can make any predictions, so I'm just going to maybe talk about what I would like to see in the next 5 years. I mean, Bruce points out a really important point about, like, a lot of what we talked about doesn't actually entail, like, the other half of the population with the gig workers and the insecure workers, where you see a falling decline of wages as well as in the security of jobs. And I'm hoping that, first of all, those kind of issues we will be able to kind of address societally or even globally to ensure that those workers are protected, because once, like, those, you know, that kind of insecurity will trickle on to the other middle, like even upper jobs if left unattended. But more importantly, like, so the other things that I would like to see is that I would like to see that, again, as David said, some of the bullshit job kind of element, that hopefully that we'll all be working shorter hours, so, you know, like the 4-day week or the 30-hour week, where we only do and focus on some of the meaningful work and not some of the frills and things that was there just to kind of maybe stroke someone's ego. But like where a lot of people are able to work remotely, and one of the things that kind of we were mentioned in the beginning, but we didn't talk more about, is that how much remote working can actually, especially if it's done in the longer term, will provide like environmental issues, so to help us kind of tackle environmental issues, which is a really big thing, as well as geographical inequalities, because once people are able to work from home and then or just come in once and then, that really allows people to kind of live in some of the geographical areas that, you know, are further away from some of the big cities, and that's going to really change communities as well. And hopefully through that we'll also see much more of a building of communities as well, where we don't only just work 50, 60 hours a week and our lives are just defined by the work we do as a part of our paid work, but other types of voluntary work, care work, etc. So, I mean, 5 years is a very short period of time, so I'm not saying that that would all happen, but some kind of direction towards that would be a very welcome movement.
Excellent. Now we've got time for a couple of quick questions. One of our clients actually emailed a question to us, and this particular client highlighted, we know the advantages of working at home and working remotely, but thinking about the disadvantages around the lack of human interaction and feelings of isolation. Bruce, I'm going to direct this question to you. How do you think the disadvantages can be mitigated?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't underestimate the fact that, it's very easy to form a perspective of working from home that's based on your subjective experience that misses out a lot of people. I joined a business school webinar a couple of weeks ago, and one of the lecturers said, well, we're all in a position now where we've all got our home offices sorted. And there was most certainly a large number of people dialing in, a lot of younger sort of people earlier in their career trajectory, who the idea that they're going to somehow afford a home office seems to be completely incompatible with the amount they earn and property costs. So I think, a lot of us can maybe regard our own experience and forget that, I think David made the point about inclusivity, but, forget that, these people who are having a very different experience. So look, from my point of view, I think these big opportunities presented by this, but the challenge for all of us is that there are going to be these experiences of isolation. There's going to be, I think, an expectation from a lot of people that some of the things that work used to provide, accidentally, training was often, for a lot of organizations, it wasn't a prescriptive syllabus, but rather more you learnt it overhearing fragments of conversations from the office elders. And I think good organizations are going to be taking more account of those things holistically, the whole experience of work from the lounge to the bedroom to occasionally in the office, and making sure that people feel that they're being developed across all of those areas. Yeah.
Now the million-dollar question, what do you think is the perfect balance of remote working in isolation?
Look, I think Heejung said it, but, if people are having to go into the office 2 days a week, then the whole benefit of working remotely is completely deleted. The reason why I think, to the point of talking about that automatic company again, is that if you can go and work from the Highlands of Scotland, if you can go and work from the fjords of Scandinavia, then it permits you to actually get some benefit from this experience of not being in the office. You could probably get a bit more room. If you're having to make the commute in 2 or 3 days a week, which is, some organizations have said, oh yeah, we're going to have people in for meetings, well, then you're not getting any of the upside of that we could be benefiting from this. So to my mind, firms need to make a decision. Are they pretty much expecting people to stay within a 60-minute commute from big cities and then hauling them in when it suits? I can very much see Martin Sorrell said he was going to get rid of his offices and spend the money on salaries for his employees. But if you have to remain within commuting distance and your clients want to meet 4 times a week, then there's very little upside, there's very little actual advantage from the experiment we're going through. So I think firms need to make a decision. Are you going to untether people from the office and work out other ways to energize your team, or are you pretty much just going to try and halve your property bill and haul people in on Monday, Wednesday and Friday?
But I think we need to be a bit cautious about not enforcing. I think, David, you mentioned that, like, you don't want to enforce people to work from home only, because there are certain people, as Bruce, you said, like, they don't have the capacity to work from home because they don't have the space. They probably don't like the boundary blurring as well, that they do want to keep their work and private sphere separate. So I would expect, especially in the near future, that there will be a combination of the various different things. And the most important thing is to give people the choice. And the choice and freedom without any repercussion is really crucial here. Because once, for example, as Bruce said, completely remote working, where everybody's remote working, then that's fine. If everybody's in the office, possibly that's fine. But if you have a mixture, then you might be able, you might end up with stigmatizing one group or the other without actual real evidence as to why that happens. So you need to make sure that when you have a combination that no one is stigmatized because they're in the office or mostly working from home, and that the people who are working remotely do not feel like this is some sort of a gift that they need to reciprocate or pay back, that, you know, that you wouldn't have done if you are going into the office. And it is something that possibly people are even doing subconsciously. So you need to really actually be able to tackle it face on and make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, I think that's sort of all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for your time, and I feel like we've only just sort of scratched the surface here and could keep talking about this all day if we had the chance. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone that's tuned in as well. Anyone that has any questions that we haven't been able to answer, I will see if we can, you know, pass them on to our speakers who might be happy to assist us further from there. But I think that sort of wraps it up for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.